They called it his hobby, sitting for hours with that old radio, talking to no one. But when Sarah found the Purple Heart hidden beneath the tapes, everything changed. This is the story of a war hero who saved for lives in Nazi territory and why he never stopped searching for voices in the darkness. What you're about to discover will destroy everything you thought you knew about war heroes, impossible rescues, and the promise that haunted one man for 60 years. The old man talked to his radio every morning at exactly 6 a.m. For 15 years. Harold Bennett sat in his basement workshop, speaking into a microphone connected to equipment that hadn't worked since 1987. His granddaughter Sarah could hear him through the floorboards as she got ready for school. "Good morning, this is Harold, KD8ABC. Anyone out there who needs help?" Today, the family thought it was harmless, an old man's hobby, maybe early dementia. They didn't know he was a decorated war hero. They didn't know about the four soldiers he'd saved in Nazi territory using nothing but his voice and a radio. And they certainly didn't know about the promise he'd made in a freezing forest 60 years ago. What happened next will rewrite everything you believe about heroism, sacrifice, and the power of a voice in the darkness. But first, you need to understand what Harold Bennett had been carrying since 1963. Sarah rolled her eyes as Grandpa's voice drifted up from the basement again. Same time, same routine, same one-sided conversation with static. "Morning, everyone. Weather's looking good here in Ohio. If anyone's lost out there, if anyone needs help, I'm listening." The radio had been broken for 15 years, but Harold kept searching. "Mom, why doesn't someone tell him the radio doesn't work?" Sarah asked her mother over breakfast. "Because it makes him feel useful, honey. Let him have his pretend conversations." Sarah's mother, Linda, had tried explaining that the equipment was beyond repair. The antenna fell in a storm. The whole system was basically expensive junk. But Harold just smiled and patted her hand. "Doesn't matter if it's broken, sweetheart. What matters is that I keep looking." If Sarah had studied her grandfather's face that morning, she might have seen the guilt in his eyes, might have noticed how he touched his chest where something was hidden beneath his shirt. But she was 17 and thought she understood everything. She didn't know that some promises are heavier than life itself. That night, Harold made an entry in the notebook he'd kept for 15 years. Day 5479. Still searching, still listening. I promised them I'd never stop looking for voices in the dark. Harold Bennett died on a Tuesday morning in March. They found him in his workshop chair, the microphone still in his hand, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. He'd been in the middle of his morning search when his heart simply stopped. The paramedics said it was quick, the kind of death soldiers pray for. But Sarah couldn't shake the image of her grandfather dying alone, calling out to people who couldn't hear him. The funeral was small. Harold had outlived most of his friends. A few neighbors came, some people from the church. The pastor spoke about Harold's kindness, his daily routine with the radio, his devotion to his late wife Martha. No one mentioned the war. After the service, the family gathered to sort through Harold's belongings. Sarah's mother handled the paperwork. Her uncle dealt with the furniture. Sarah got stuck with the basement. She'd always avoided that room. It smelled like old electronics and her grandfather's aftershave. Shelves lined with radio equipment from the 1970s. Dials and switches and mysterious devices she couldn't name. And there, in the center, was the microphone setup where Harold had spent 15 years talking to the void. Sarah was packing it all for donation when she noticed something tucked behind the main console. A wooden box, heavy, military green. Inside were hundreds of cassette tapes, each labeled with a date in Harold's careful handwriting. The first tape was dated 15 years ago, the day after the radio broke. But that wasn't what made Sarah's hands shake. Beneath the tapes was something she'd never seen before. A Purple Heart medal, a silver star, and a faded photograph of four young soldiers standing beside a crashed helicopter. In a snowy forest, Sarah stared at the military decorations, her mind reeling. Her grandfather had been decorated for valor, for saving lives, for heroism in combat. But he'd never told anyone. She picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. for young soldiers, all smiling despite their bandaged wounds. In the background, the twisted wreckage of what looked like a military helicopter. One of the soldiers had written on the back in faded ink, "Thanks to Harold Bennett, we all made it home." Black Forest, December 1963. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. Her grandfather hadn't just been a radio operator. He'd been a war hero, a man who'd saved lives under fire. She found an old cassette player and slipped in the first tape. Harold's voice filled the basement, younger and stronger than she remembered. Day 1, March 15th. The antenna came down last night. Equipment's fried. Can't afford to fix it. But I made a promise in the Black Forest. I told Danny and the others that as long as I had breath in my body and a radio to use, I'd never stop looking for. Voices lost in the dark. Radio's broken now. But the promise isn't. Sarah's breath caught. Danny, one of the soldiers in the photograph. If someone's out there, if someone needs help, I want them to know I'm still searching, still listening. I may not be able to hear you, but I haven't forgotten you. Harold's voice broke slightly. I saved for lives in that forest 60 years ago. But there are others. There are always others. People lost in the darkness, waiting for someone to find them. So I'll keep talking, keep searching, even if this broken radio never works again. Because a promise is a promise. Sarah stared at the tape player, finally understanding. Her grandfather hadn't been talking to broken equipment for 15 years. He'd been keeping a promise for soldiers he'd saved in Nazi territory. He'd been searching for more voices in the dark. But what Sarah discovered next would prove that Harold's broken radio had been working all along, and that his voice had traveled further than anyone thought possible. Because tucked beneath the metals was a letter postmarked just 2 weeks after Harold's death, from someone who had been listening, someone who was alive today, because Harold Bennett never stopped searching for voices lost in the darkness. Now you're going to learn what really happened in the Black Forest in December 1963. Harold Bennett was 26 years old and stationed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Officially, he was a radio operator responsible for maintaining communication between NATO forces across Europe. Unofficially, he was the best search and rescue coordinator the military had ever seen. Harold had what his commanding officers called the gift. He could pull voices out of static that other operators couldn't even hear. He could triangulate positions using radio signals that seemed impossible to trace. He could guide rescue teams through terrain that would have been impassable without his voice in their ears. For 2 years, Harold had coordinated dozens of successful rescues, lost hikers in the Alps, downed pilots behind enemy lines, refugees fleeing communist territories. His call sign, KD8ABC, was known throughout the European theater as the voice that could find anyone, anywhere. But the mission that would define the rest of his life began at 03:07 on December 18th, 1963. A UH-1 Huey helicopter carrying classified surveillance equipment had gone down during a blizzard near the East German border. For soldiers aboard, radio contact lost, weather conditions preventing immediate rescue, and Soviet patrols were already searching the area. The helicopter had been carrying prototype electronic warfare equipment that could not fall into enemy hands. The mission was simple: find the crew before the Soviets did, retrieve the classified materials, and get everyone out alive. The problem was that no one knew exactly where the Huey had crashed. The blizzard had knocked out most radio communications. Radar had lost the helicopter's signal 20 miles from the crash site. Search aircraft couldn't fly in the storm. Ground teams couldn't move through the heavy snow. The 4 soldiers were on their own in sub-zero temperatures, possibly injured, definitely outgunned if Soviet forces found them first. That's when Harold volunteered for an unauthorized mission, using equipment he wasn't supposed to have access to. Harold began sweeping radio frequencies that were officially off-limits, military, channels that could get him court-martialed if anyone discovered what he was doing. He searched for 6 hours without success. Weak signals that faded to nothing. False alarms that led nowhere. Static that might have been voices or might have been atmospheric interference. Then, at 09 for 7 hours, Harold heard something that made his blood freeze. A faint transmission in broken English, heavily accented, definitely not American. Soviet forces had found something in the forest. Harold listened as Russian voices coordinated a search pattern. They were closing in on something, moving methodically through the woods, getting closer to whatever they were hunting. Harold had maybe 30 minutes before the Soviets found the crashed helicopter. That's when he heard it, barely audible through the static, an American voice, weak and desperate. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Delta 7-4. Anyone out there? We're hurt bad and need immediate extraction." Harold keyed his microphone without hesitation. "Delta 7-4, this is KD8ABC. I hear you. What's your status?" The relief in the American voice was palpable. "KD8ABC, thank God. We've got 4 souls aboard. Pilot's unconscious. Co-pilot has a broken leg. I'm Sergeant Danny Morrison, door gunner. Got shrapnel in my shoulder, but I'm mobile." "What about your 4th man, Private Jenkins?" "He's hurt bad. Internal injuries. We need medical evacuation now." "Danny, I'm going to get you out of there. But I need you to listen carefully. Soviet forces are searching your area. They're maybe 20 minutes from your position. Jesus, we can't move Jenkins. He'll die if we try to carry him." "You're not going to carry him. I'm going to guide a rescue team to your exact location. But first, I need to know where you are for the next 10 minutes. Harold used every trick he'd learned in 2 years of search and rescue operations. He had Danny describe landmarks, take radio bearings, even count steps in different directions to triangulate their position slowly. Harold built a mental map of exactly where the helicopter had crashed. Then came the hard part. "Danny, there's a Soviet patrol about half a mile north of your position. They're moving south in a sweep pattern. In 15 minutes, they're going to be right on top of you. What do we do?" "You're going to move, all of you, even Jenkins. I told you we can't move him. He's barely conscious. Danny, listen to me. There's a ravine about 200 yards southeast of your position, deep enough to hide a helicopter. If you can get Jenkins there, you'll be invisible from ground level." Harold had never seen the terrain, had never been to the Black Forest, but he'd studied topographical maps for hours, cross-referencing Danny's descriptions with known geographical features. He was navigating for wounded soldiers through Nazi territory using nothing but radio signals and educated guesses. "How do you know about the ravine?" Danny asked. "Because I'm looking at a map and praying I'm right. Now move." For the next hour, Harold guided the wounded soldiers through the forest, step by step, turn by turn, avoiding Soviet patrols that passed within yards of their position. When Jenkins collapsed, Harold talked Danny through field medical procedures. When the co-pilot's broken leg gave out, Harold found them a route that avoided steep terrain. When they got lost in the blizzard, Harold used radio signal strength to guide them back on course. Finally, after the longest hour of Harold's life, Danny's voice came through the radio. "KD8ABC, we made it. We're in the ravine. Can't see more than 10 feet in any direction, but we're hidden. Good. Now comes the hard part. I've got a rescue team mobilizing, but they can't reach you for another 6 hours. You need to stay warm, stay quiet, and keep Jenkins alive." "How?" "I'm going to talk you through it." For the next 6 hours, Harold Bennett became a lifeline for 4 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. He talked them through treating Jenkins's injuries with supplies from their medical kit. He guided them in building a shelter, using pieces of the wrecked helicopter. He coordinated supply drops from aircraft that couldn't land but could throw packages out into the snow. Most importantly, he kept them awake, kept them fighting, kept them believing that rescue was coming. When hypothermia started setting in, Harold told them jokes. When despair threatened to overwhelm them, Harold shared stories about home. When Jenkins stopped responding, Harold talked Danny through CPR using only radio instructions. At 16:30 hours, the rescue team finally reached the ravine. All 4 soldiers were alive. Danny Morrison was the last one loaded into the evacuation helicopter. Before they carried him aboard, he keyed his radio one final time. "KD8ABC, this is Danny. We're all going home because of you. All 4 of us. I don't know how you did it, but you saved our lives. Harold's voice was hoarse from 6 hours of constant communication. "Just glad you're safe, Danny. That's what we're here for, Danny. There's something I need you to promise me, anything, if you ever get lost again. If you ever need help, call for me. Doesn't matter where you are or what time it is. I'll be listening. That's a promise, Harold. But I got a promise for you too." "What's that?" "If anything ever happens to you, if you ever need help, I'll be listening too. All 4 of us will be. You saved our lives. We owe you everything." Harold smiled as the helicopter disappeared into the snowy sky. He had no idea that promise would define the rest of his life. 2 weeks later, Harold was awarded the Silver Star for valor in combat. The Purple Heart came when he was wounded in a separate rescue operation 3 months later. Harold never told his family about the medals, never talked about the war. When people asked what he'd done in the military, he just said he'd worked on radios. It was easier than explaining that he'd spent 2 years being a voice in the darkness for people who had nowhere else to turn. When Harold returned to Ohio in 1965, he got his amateur radio license. For 22 years, he talked to people all over the world: truck drivers on lonely highways, ships in distress, anyone who needed to know they weren't alone. But he never forgot the promise he'd made to Danny Morrison and the others: "I'll be listening, no matter where you are or what time it is." Then, in 1987, the antenna came down in a storm. Harold's family expected him to fix it or replace it or give up the hobby. They didn't understand that for Harold, the radio wasn't a hobby, it was a sacred duty. So he kept broadcasting, even when the equipment was broken, even when he was sure no one could hear him. Because Harold Bennett had made a promise to for soldiers in the Black Forest. And Harold Bennett never broke a promise. For 15 years, he kept faith with that vow. Never knowing that his voice was still reaching people who desperately needed to hear it. Never realizing that Danny Morrison had kept his promise too, and was listening from the other side of the world. Sarah spent the next week uncovering her grandfather's secret life. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt about dismissing him as a lonely old man talking to broken equipment. Harold Bennett had been a genuine war hero, a man who'd risked everything to save the lives of strangers, a voice in the darkness who'd guided people home when no one else could reach them. The cassette tapes revealed 15 years of daily broadcasts, but now Sarah understood what she was really hearing. These weren't the ramblings of a confused elderly man, they were the continued mission of a soldier who'd never stopped serving. Good morning. This is Harold, KD8ABC. If anyone's out there who needs help, who's lost or scared or hurt, I want you to know someone's listening. Someone cares. You're not alone. Harold's voice on the tapes was gentle but strong. The voice of a man who'd spent his life being a lifeline for people in crisis. Sarah learned that her grandfather had coordinated rescues throughout the 1960s and 70s. Hikers lost in national parks, fishermen stranded in storms, even runaway teenagers who'd called amateur radio operators when they had nowhere else to turn. Harold had saved dozens of lives over the decades, but the first soldiers in the Black Forest had been special. They were his first rescue, the mission that taught him what his true calling was. As Sarah listened to tape after tape, she began to understand the weight Harold had carried. Day 3247. Been thinking about Danny Morrison today. Wonder if he ever made it home to his family. Wonder if Jenkins recovered from his injuries. Probably all have grandchildren by now. I keep broadcasting in case any of them ever need help again. Made them a promise. Figure that promise doesn't expire just because the radio's broken. Sarah found herself crying as she listened to her grandfather's words. He'd spent 15 years honoring a commitment he'd made to for soldiers he'd saved 60 years ago. On the 5th day of going through Harold's belongings, Sarah found something that changed everything. A letter addressed to Harold, postmarked. Just 3 weeks after his death, the return address was from a Daniel Morrison in Phoenix, Arizona. Danny Morrison, the sergeant from the helicopter crash. Sarah opened the letter with shaking hands. Dear Harold, I hope this reaches you. I've been trying to track you down for years. Finally found your call sign through veteran records. I'm Danny Morrison. You saved my life, and the lives of 3 other soldiers in the Black Forest in December 1963. I was the door gunner who talked to you on the radio for 6 hours while we waited for rescue. I don't know if you remember us. You probably saved a lot of people over the years, but I remember you. We all do. Harold, I need you to know what happened to the 4 soldiers you rescued that day. Private Jenkins, the kid with internal injuries, made a full recovery. He became a doctor, spent 40 years working in emergency medicine, saving lives. He always said he became a doctor because someone saved his life when he was 19. He died peacefully in 2018, surrounded by family. Corporal Hayes, our co-pilot, with the broken leg, became a pilot for a medical evacuation company, flew rescue helicopters for 30 years, saved hundreds of lives. He said you taught him what it meant to be a voice in the darkness for people who need help. Lieutenant Parker, our pilot, became a pastor, spent his life ministering to people in crisis. He said listening to your voice in that ravine showed him what real faith looked like. The faith to keep helping even when you can't see the results. And me, I became a radio operator. Just like you, spent 30 years coordinating search and rescue operations. I became KD8XYZ, and for 3 decades, I was the voice people heard when they were lost and scared and needed someone to guide them home. Harold, the 4 men you saved that day went on to save thousands of other lives. Your voice in the darkness created a ripple effect that's still spreading 60 years later. But there's something else you need to know. I kept the promise I made to you in that ravine. I've been listening for your call sign for 60 years when amateur radio went digital. I set up automated monitoring systems. I've been recording every transmission on your frequency since 1975. Harold, I heard you. Every morning for the past 15 years, your equipment may have been broken, but your signal was getting out. Atmospheric conditions, solar interference, something was bouncing your transmissions all over the world. I have thousands of hours of recordings of your daily broadcasts, and I've been sharing them. There's a network of us now, former soldiers you helped, people you saved. We've been distributing your messages to crisis hotlines, suicide prevention centers, emergency services around the world. Your voice has been talking people down from bridges, giving hope to refugees, comforting the grieving. For 15 years, you've been saving lives and didn't even know it. Harold, you never stopped being the voice in the darkness. You just couldn't hear us talking back. I'm 81 years old now. I wanted to find you before it was too late, to tell you that the promise you made in the Black Forest was kept. You never stopped listening, you never stopped helping, and we never stopped being grateful. I'm flying to Ohio next month. I hope we can meet. I'd like to shake the hand of the man who saved my life and taught me what it means to serve others. Your friend forever, Danny Morrison P.S. I'm enclosing something that belongs to you. Sarah looked in the envelope and found a small medal, bronze, worn smooth by decades of handling. A note was attached. This is the bronze star they gave me for the Black Forest mission, but we all know it belongs to you. You were the real hero that day. Sarah stared at the medal, tears streaming down her face. Her grandfather had died, thinking his 15 years of broadcasts had been pointless, that his broken radio had condemned him to talking to the void. He'd never known that Danny Morrison had been listening all along, had never realized that his voice was still saving lives around the world, had never understood that his promise to 4 soldiers had been kept in ways he couldn't imagine. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the number on Danny's letter. An elderly man answered, his voice immediately familiar from the stories Harold had told. Danny Morrison, yes, this is Sarah Bennett, Harold's granddaughter. There was a long pause. Then, very quietly, is Harold still with us? I'm sorry. He passed away 3 weeks ago. Sarah heard Danny Morrison begin to cry. I'm too late. God, I'm too late. No, Sarah said firmly, you're not too late. Harold would have been so proud to know you remembered him, so happy to know his voice was still reaching people. Sarah told Danny about the tapes, about Harold's 15 years of faithful broadcasting, about his belief that someone, somewhere, might need to hear his voice. When she finished, Danny was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Last month, I got a call from a crisis center in Germany. A 16-year-old boy had called their suicide hotline. He was ready to give up. Sarah felt her heart clench. The counselor played him one of Harold's recordings. One of the messages about hope, about not giving up, about remembering that someone cares even when you feel alone. Danny's voice broke. The boy listened to the entire recording. Then he asked to hear it again. Harold's voice talked him down from the bridge, saved his life. That boy is alive today because your grandfather kept talking to a broken radio for 15 years. Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Danny, there's something I need to ask you. Harold always wondered if you made it home safely, if you had a good life. I did, Sarah. I had a wonderful life. Married my high school sweetheart. Had 3 kids, 7 grandchildren. Spent 30 years saving people the way Harold saved me. And every morning for the past 15 years, I listened to Harold's broadcasts and remembered what it felt like to hear hope in the darkness. Sarah, your grandfather gave me more than my life back in that forest. He gave me my purpose. He showed me what it means to be there for people when they need you most. Danny paused. I'd like to come to Ohio, to pay my respects, to meet the family of the man who saved my life and changed everything about how I see the world. 3 days later, Danny Morrison flew to Ohio. Sarah met him at the airport, an elderly man with silver hair and bright eyes, walking with the straight posture of someone who'd spent his life in service to others. He carried a worn duffel bag and moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to respect how precious life could be. When Sarah shook his hand, she felt like she was touching a piece of history. This man had been in that ravine 60 years ago, had heard her grandfather's voice guide him through the darkness, had spent his life honoring the promise they'd made to each other. Danny spent 3 days in Ohio, visiting Harold's grave, meeting the family, sharing stories about the grandfather they'd never really known. But the most important moment came when Danny opened his duffel bag in Harold's old workshop. Inside was a military radio, old but meticulously maintained, the same model Harold had used in Germany 60 years ago. I've been carrying this since 1963, Danny said. It's the radio I used to talk to Harold in the Black Forest. I wanted him to have it. Danny connected the radio to Harold's old antenna system, the antenna that had been repaired after the storm, but never properly reconnected to the broken equipment. When Danny turned on the radio, Harold's workshop filled with voices, ham radio operators from around the world, many of them using Harold's old call sign as a memorial, search and rescue coordinators sharing his recorded messages, crisis counselors who'd been trained using Harold's techniques for talking to people in distress, a whole network of people who'd been touched by Harold's voice over the decades. Danny keyed the microphone and spoke into it. This is KD8XYZ, calling in memory of Harold Bennett. KD8ABC, the voice in the darkness who taught us all what it means to serve. Responses came in immediately. Dozens of voices from around the world, all sharing the same message. Harold Bennett saved my life. Harold Bennett gave me hope. Harold Bennett taught me to keep listening. Sarah sat in her grandfather's chair, listening to voice after voice testify to the impact of a man her family had never really understood. A man who'd spent 15 years talking to a broken radio because he'd made a promise to for soldiers in a forest 60 years ago. A man whose voice had traveled further and touched more lives than anyone could have imagined. Danny Morrison looked at Sarah and smiled. Your grandfather kept his promise, Sarah. He never stopped listening. He never stopped helping. And he never stopped being the voice people heard when they needed hope most. Now it's our job to keep his promise alive. Sarah kept her grandfather's radio set up exactly as Harold had left it. But now she understood what it really was, not the hobby of a confused old man, but the sacred mission of a hero who'd never stopped serving. Every morning at 6 a.m., Sarah sits in Harold's chair and continues his work. She speaks into the microphone, carrying on the tradition that began in a forest in Germany 60 years ago. She tells Harold's story, Danny Morrison's story, the story of four soldiers who were saved by a voice in the darkness. But mostly, she continues Harold's mission. She reaches out to anyone who might be listening. anyone who might be lost, scared, alone, or in need of hope. Good morning, this is Sarah, KN8ABC, continuing the watch for Harold Bennett. If you're out there and you need help, someone's listening, someone cares, you're not alone. The workshop that was once filled with one old man talking to broken equipment is now the center of a global network. Danny Morrison helped Sarah connect with the other survivors from the Black Forest. Lieutenant Parker, the pastor, contributes daily devotionals that Sarah broadcasts. Corporal Hayes, the medical helicopter pilot, shares rescue techniques and emergency procedures together. They've created the Harold Bennett Memorial Network, a 24-hour amateur radio emergency service that covers 6 continents. Crisis centers around the world use Harold's recorded messages to train their counselors. His techniques for talking to people in distress are taught in emergency response schools. His approach to being a voice of hope in the darkness has become a model for volunteer organizations everywhere. But the most important part of Harold's legacy isn't the official recognition or the training programs. It's the individual lives that continue to be saved by his voice. Marcus, the 16-year-old in Germany who was talked down from suicide by one of Harold's recordings. Elena, the refugee who heard Harold's broadcast about not giving up hope just when she was ready to stop trying. James, the lost hiker who survived 3 days in the mountains by listening to Harold's messages about perseverance and faith. Hundreds of others whose names Sarah will never know, but whose lives were touched by the voice of a man who never stopped believing that someone out there needed to hear from him. 6 months after Danny Morrison's visit, Sarah received a package from Germany. Inside was a small wooden radio, hand-carved by Marcus, the teenager whose life had been saved by Harold's voice. A note was attached. Dear Sarah, my name is Marcus. I am the boy from Berlin whose life was saved by your grandfather's words. I have been learning English so I could write to you. I wanted you to know that Harold Bennett is a hero in Germany. We tell his story to young people who are struggling. We play his recordings in schools and hospitals. Your grandfather's voice crossed an ocean and 60 years to save my life. Now, I want to spend my life being that voice for others. I am studying to be a counselor someday. I want to work on crisis hotlines, helping people the way Harold helped me. This radio doesn't work. It's just carved wood. But I made it to remind us that sometimes the most important messages don't need working equipment to reach the people who need to hear them. They just need someone who refuses to stop trying. Thank you for continuing Harold's mission. Thank you for keeping his promise alive. Your friend in Germany. Marcus. Sarah placed the wooden radio on the shelf next to Harold's purple heart and silver star, physical reminders of a truth that had taken her family 60 years to understand. Harold Bennett wasn't a confused old man talking to broken equipment. He was a war hero who'd saved for lives in Nazi territory and then spent the rest of his life living up to the promise he'd made in that forest. He was a voice in the darkness who never stopped believing that someone somewhere needed to hear that they weren't alone. He was living proof that the most important missions are often the ones that no one sees, no one recognizes, and no one understands until years after they're completed. And his broken radio had worked perfectly. It had just taken 60 years for anyone to realize it. Every year on December 18th, the anniversary of the Black Forest Rescue, amateur radio operators around the world observe Harold Bennett Day. For 24 hours, people tune their radios to Harold's old frequency and share messages of hope, stories of rescue, voices of encouragement for anyone who might be listening. Sarah coordinates the event from Harold's workshop, surrounded by the equipment he'd used for 15 years to keep faith with for soldiers he'd saved in the snow. But the most moving moment comes at exactly 09 for 7 hours. The time Harold first heard Danny Morrison's voice calling for help. Danny Morrison, now 82 but still strong, keys his radio from Phoenix and speaks the words that started it all. Mayday, Mayday, this is Delta 74. Anyone out there? And from radios around the world, hundreds of voices respond with the same message. This is the Harold Bennett Memorial Network. We hear you. You're not alone. Help is on the way. Because some promises echo across decades, some voices carry further. than anyone thought possible. And some heroes spend their entire lives being exactly who they need to be, even when no one understands what they're doing. Harold Bennett made a promise in the Black Forest in 1963. He kept that promise for 60 years. And now, through the network of people whose lives he touched, his voice continues to reach into the darkness, searching for anyone who needs to know they're not alone. The broken radio still sits in Harold's workshop. It still doesn't work, but Harold's voice has never been stronger. Thanks for spending time with us today. If this story of Harold Bennett meant something to you, pass it on, because somewhere, someone is lost in the darkness and needs to hear a voice of hope. This is still standing. Souls, real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.